Welcome. Tonight we are exploring the history of Viking blood in America, from the rusted bronze cloak pin abandoned on a remote Canadian beach to a piece of 11th century chopped wood bearing the precise chemical signature of a massive solar storm. This is the story of a fleeting human expansion across a frozen ocean and the enduring cultural obsession that drove generations of immigrants to carve false runestones just to claim a piece of that ancient myth. Please feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a thought below. Now settle in, soften your shoulders, slow your breathing. Let us begin. In the summer of the year 985, a Norse merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson anchors his trading vessel at Eyrar, a coastal trading post in southern Iceland. He commands a knar, a broad-hulled cargo ship measuring 54 feet in length. Shipwrights constructed the vessel from overlapping oak planks fastened with iron rivets. Pine tar coats the exterior wood to seal the seams against the salt water. The central hold carries a cargo of iron tools, woven wool cloth, and building timber harvested from the forests of Norway. Bjarni prepares to sail to Greenland to join his father, Herjolf, who migrated westward earlier that same year. The crew consists of 20 Norse sailors. The men load wooden casks of fresh water and salted cod into the open hull. They raise a 50-foot mast made from a single pine tree trunk. The sailors hoist a square woolen sail woven from the fleece of Icelandic sheep. They coat the woven fabric with walrus fat to repel the rain and sea spray. The wind catches the heavy wool and pushes the knar westward into the Denmark Strait. The crew sails for 3 days across the open ocean. The volcanic mountains of Iceland disappear below the eastern horizon. The navigator relies on a wooden sun compass to maintain a western heading. A northern wind pushes a thick layer of fog across the water. The air temperature drops to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew loses sight of the sun in the white sky. The wind shifts abruptly, blowing strongly from the north. Ocean currents push the wooden hull southward, off the established route. The men sail for many days through the dense water vapor. They sit on wooden benches and bail seawater from the bottom of the hull using carved wooden scoops. The steersman holds the large side rudder, relying on the direction of the sea swell to maintain the physical stability of the ship. The atmospheric pressure changes and the winds shift to blow from the south. The fog dissipates over the surface of the water. The crew observes the position of the sun in the sky. They use the sun's height above the horizon to determine their latitude. Bjarni orders the men to hoist the square sail again. The sailors pull the hemp ropes and secure the rigging to the iron cleats on the deck. They sail westward for 24 hours. A continuous coastline appears on the western horizon. The crew guides the knar closer to inspect the landmass. They see a flat terrain covered entirely in dense timber. Small topographical hillocks rise gently from the tree line. Bjarni observes the unbroken canopy of leaves and the exposed soil. He compares this topography to the established descriptions of Greenland, which detail massive ice sheets and deep, rocky fjords. He concludes this location is a separate, uncharted landmass. The crew asks to lower the stone anchor and take a small boat ashore. They request permission to search for fresh drinking water and harvest firewood. Bjarni commands the men to remain on the ship. The sailors adjust the side rudder and turn the wooden prow away from the shore. The crew angles the vessel back toward the open ocean. A southwest wind fills the walrus fat-coated sail. The ship travels for 2 full days along the prevailing air currents. A second shoreline emerges from the dark water ahead of them. The knar approaches the coast. The men observe a flat terrain dominated by tall pine and spruce trees. The salt spray coats the wooden deck, as the waves hit the oak hull. The sailors again request to stop the ship. They point to the vast timber resources visible on the shore. Bjarni instructs the steersman to hold their course. The men adjust the hemp rigging and continue sailing along the water. They leave the forested coast behind them, moving further north. The southwest wind continues to blow steadily across the North Atlantic. The Knarr sails for 3 more days across the open, rolling swells. A third landmass comes into view off the port bow. The physical structure of this region contrasts sharply with the previous 2 shores. The men see high elevations, steep granite cliffs, and a massive sheet of glacial ice capping the mountain peaks. The ship sails parallel to the rocky shore for several hours. The crew identifies the perimeter of the landmass, establishing that it is an island surrounded entirely by the sea. Bjarni directs the helmsman to steer the ship away from the rocky island and back out into the open wind. The wind intensifies into a strong gale, pushing the 54-foot hull rapidly across the water. The crew lowers the square sail by half its height. This reduction decreases the mechanical strain on the central pine mast. The men hold the rigging tightly as the Knarr cuts through the steep waves. They sail for 4 continuous days under the strong winds. The jagged, ice-covered mountains of the Greenland coast finally appear ahead of them. Bjarni navigates the ship toward a rocky promontory on the southern tip of the landmass. He recognizes the specific topography of Herjolfsnes, the coastal settlement established by his father earlier in the year 985. The men navigate the ship into the narrow fjord. They drop a heavy stone anchor into the cold water. The Knarr settles near the stone and turf houses of the colony. Bjarni steps off the wooden deck and walks onto the gravel beach. He joins the new Greenland colony and reports his observations to the local inhabitants. He details the vast, unharvested forests located just a few days' sail to the west. These settlers construct their houses from gathered driftwood and imported timber. They rely on these rare wood sources to build their ships, roofs, and tools. The residents listen closely to the descriptions of the dense tree lines. The Greenland colony currently works to expand its agricultural base along the deep coastal fjords. Eric the Red organizes this new agrarian society from his large stone and turf estate located up the coast at Brattahlid. Eric the Red expands his agricultural estate at Brattahlid, located at the inner end of Eriksfjord on the southwestern coast of Greenland. The farm complex sits 50 miles inland from the open ocean, sheltered by steep granite cliffs. Workers construct the main longhouse using slabs of cut turf and dry-stacked fieldstones. The earthen walls measure 6 feet thick to retain heat during the winter months. A central stone hearth burns dried peat, filling the interior space with grey smoke and the scent of smouldering soil. Because the local Arctic landscape lacks tall trees, the builders support the heavy sod roof using pieces of driftwood collected from the shoreline. During the late 10th century, the Northern Hemisphere experiences a documented climatic phase known as the medieval warm period. Average regional temperatures rise by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. This specific thermal shift melts the seasonal pack ice, blocking the coastal inlets. Glacial runoff flows continuously into the deep fjords, depositing rich silt onto the valley floors. Thick grasses and sedges grow rapidly in these coastal meadows during the short summer season. The Norse settlers graze imported Icelandic cattle, sheep and goats on these green pastures. The estate requires constant physical labor to maintain the livestock. The Norse farmers dig shallow irrigation ditches to channel mountain runoff directly into their hayfields. They harvest the tall grass using iron scythes in late August. They dry the cut grass in the sun to create winter fodder for the cattle. The cows remain inside the stone-walled barns for 6 continuous months, consuming the dried hay while sheltered from the heavy snow accumulation. The settlers shovel wet manure from the barn floors using wooden spades, stockpiling the waste to use as soil fertilizer in the spring. The animals produce milk, which the inhabitants ferment into skyr using bacterial cultures and press into dense wheels of cheese. Women process the sheep's fleece into woolen yarn using carved soapstone spindle whorls. The community expands to include over 400 residents, distributed across a network of individual coastal farmsteads. They divide the settled territory into the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. Eric the Red manages the local legal assembly, dictating property boundaries and organizing trade regulations. His adult son, Leif Erikson, resides at the Brattahlid estate. Leif observes the rapid depletion of imported Norwegian timber within the colony. The settlers burn low-growing Arctic willow and dwarf birch scrub to produce charcoal for their stone iron smelting furnaces. The landscape continuously loses its sparse brush cover due to this aggressive harvesting. The Greenland colonists rely on massive, straight tree trunks to construct new ocean-going cargo ships and to replace rotting roof beams. Hunters travel north along the ice sheets to Disco Bay to harvest walruses. They extract the ivory tusks and thick marine hides using iron-bladed knives. The colonists trade these Arctic animal products with visiting European merchants in exchange for iron ingots and intact timber logs. The sailing journey from Norway to Greenland requires several weeks on the open ocean, severely limiting the volume of heavy wood brought to the settlements. Leif listens to the repeated accounts of Bjarni Herjolfsson's coastal drift 14 years prior. He speaks directly with the older sailors who manned the oars on Bjarni's initial voyage. The men describe the exact wind patterns they experienced and the flat, forested shorelines located to the west. Leif recognizes the economic value of a localized timber source. Around the year 999, Leif travels down the fjord to negotiate directly with Bjarni. Leif purchases the 54-foot oak knar that Bjarni originally sailed past the western coastlines. Leif exchanges silver rings and woven wool cloth for the legal ownership of the vessel. The wooden ship sits pulled up on a gravel beach near the settlement. Local shipwrights inspect the overlapping oak planks and the iron rivets securing the hull. The workers scrape calcified marine barnacles from the lower strakes using iron chisels. They apply fresh pine tar over the exterior wood. The thick black tar seals the structural joints and protects the timber against the corrosive salt water. The crew weaves new ropes out of twisted walrus hide to secure the heavy pine mast. Leif gathers a crew of 35 local men to handle the heavy side rudder and control the square woolen sail. Leif stockpiles iron axes, broad axes, and wooden wedges in the open hull of the ship. The crew requires these specific metal tools to fell tall trees and split the harvested wood into usable timber planks. They pack whetstones carved from quartz to continuously sharpen the steel cutting edges during the logging process. The sailors load tightly stitched leather sleeping bags and wooden chests filled with dried cod onto the wooden deck. They fill large wooden vats with fresh stream water and secure the lids with hemp ropes. The men board the vessel and take their designated positions on the wooden rowing benches. Leif instructs the crew to cast off the mooring lines. The sailors push their wooden oars into the water, pulling the oak hull away from the gravel beach. They row westward down the length of the fjord, steering the car toward the open currents of the Labrador Sea to locate the dense forests. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson directs the 54-foot oak gnar away from the Greenland coast. The crew of 35 men hoists the square woolen sail. The prevailing eastern winds push the vessel across the Davis Strait. The men measure the ocean depth using lead-sounding weights attached to hemp lines. The water temperature hovers near 34 degrees Fahrenheit. The sailors wear thick cloaks woven from sheep's wool and fastened with bronze pins to retain body heat. The ocean currents circulate cold water from the Arctic Ocean southward. The men sit on wooden benches and watch the grey water pass along the overlapping oak strakes of the hull. After travelling over 600 miles, the crew observes a coastline on the western horizon. Leif orders the helmsman to steer toward the shore. The sailors drop the heavy stone anchor into the coastal shallows. The men lower a small wooden rowboat into the water. Leif and a group of sailors row to the beach using spruce oars. The wooden blades push through the cold surf. The men step out of the boat onto land, composed entirely of flat, grey slate stones. Massive glaciers sit inland, pushing walls of compacted blue ice toward the shoreline. The air temperature registers near freezing. The atmospheric moisture condenses on the cold rocks. The ground consists of exposed Precambrian granite and gneiss. The coastal terrain supports patches of grey lichen. Leif observes the geology of the landscape and assigns a name to the territory. He calls the region Helluland, translating to slabland in the Old Norse language. Modern cartographers identify this specific landmass as Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic archipelago, located at 66 degrees north latitude. The crew spends several hours walking across the flat stone slabs. They collect fresh water from the glacial melt streams, filling their wooden casks. The men carry the heavy, water-filled casks back to the rowboat. They push the small boat off the rocky beach and row back to the anchored gnar. The sailors lift the casks onto the deck and secure them with braided walrus hide ropes. They raise the stone anchor by pulling the thick hemp rope around a wooden windlass. The men adjust the side rudder and angle the ship away from the slate beaches. The square sail catches the northern wind. The vessel travels southward along the coastal currents of the Labrador Sea. The sailors determine their latitude by measuring the angle of the sun above the horizon at midday using a carved wooden disc. They sail for 3 continuous days and nights. A second landmass emerges on the western horizon. The ship approaches a flat coastline, lined with broad beaches of white quartz sand. The ocean swells break onto the shallow sandbars. The men row the small boat through the surf and pull the wooden hull onto the white sand. Dense boreal forests of black spruce and balsam fir grow directly behind the beaches. The tall tree trunks stand closely together, forming a continuous canopy of green needles. The scent of pine resin and decaying leaves fills the air. The forest floor consists of a thick layer of brown pine needles and damp soil. Leif walks among the tall trees and inspects the straight trunks. He names this territory Markland, meaning forest land. Geographers correlate this location with the coast of Labrador in modern Canada, situated near 54 degrees north latitude. The crew members extract iron axes from their wooden storage chests. The blacksmiths in Greenland forged these wedge-shaped axe heads from bog iron and mounted them on ash wood handles. The men walk into the tree line and begin chopping the black spruce trees. The metal blades strike the wood, driving horizontal cuts into the trunks. The trees fall onto the forest floor, snapping the smaller lower branches. The sailors use smaller hand axes to strip the remaining branches from the main trunks. The men carry the pale, resin-coated timber logs over their shoulders back to the sandy beach. They load the harvested wood onto the open deck of the ship and stack the logs horizontally. This timber harvest provides the building materials the Greenland settlements require to construct new houses and boats. The men spend 2 days cutting timber and resting on the white sand. They harvest local waterfowl and roast the meat over open fires built from dried driftwood. They extinguish the fires with seawater and return to the ship. Leif instructs the men to continue exploring the coastline. The crew navigates the vessel back into the deeper water. A steady northern wind pushes the ship further south. The sailors keep the continuous landmass visible off the starboard bow. They travel for 2 additional days along the changing topography. The air temperature rises as they move further south. The shoreline vegetation transitions from coniferous spruce to broadleaf deciduous trees. The coastline breaks into a series of shallow bays and small islands. The crew navigates the Cairn through a narrow sound located between an island and a mainland cape pointing north. The water depth decreases rapidly in the sound. The low tide exposes broad mudflats. The oak ship runs aground on the muddy bottom. The tide recedes, leaving the vessel resting entirely on the wet mud. The men climb over the wooden sides of the hull and step directly onto the exposed seabed. They walk across the mud and up onto the grassy shore of the mainland. The men observe thick dew covering the green grass. They touch the wet grass with their hands and bring the moisture to their mouths. The dew contains a high concentration of natural sugars. The crew rests on the grass and waits for the ocean tide to return. The rising water lifts the wooden ship off the mud. The sailors guide the floating vessel up a nearby river and into a freshwater lake. They drop the stone anchor into the lake bed and prepare to construct winter houses in this new, milder region. The crew of 35 men pulls the 54-foot oak vessel onto a sloping beach composed of rounded river stones. They secure the ship to the shore using thick ropes braided from walrus hide. The men walk inland and observe a broadleaf deciduous forest containing birch, maple, and butternut trees. The air temperature registers near 60 degrees Fahrenheit during the autumn days. Leif Erikson orders the sailors to construct winter shelters on a flat, grassy terrace overlooking the water. The men strike the local hardwood trees with iron broadaxes. They split the felled trunks into horizontal planks using iron wedges and wooden mallets. The crew builds large rectangular timber halls, recording the site as Leifsbúðir in the Old Norse language. The primary longhouse measures 50 feet in length. The builders cut rectangular blocks of earth from the surrounding meadow using iron spades. They stack these thick sod blocks against the exterior wooden walls to insulate the interior space. The men build central stone hearths along the dirt floors and burn dried birch branches to generate heat. The sailors cast woven hemp nets into the adjacent freshwater river to catch Atlantic salmon. They extract the fish from the water and roast the pink meat over the open fires. Leif divides the crew into 2 rotating groups to manage the daily operations. Half the men remain at the timber halls to process the fish and maintain the buildings. The other half walks outward into the broadleaf forest to survey the topography. Leif implements a strict schedule requiring the survey team to return to the camp before sunset. He commands the men to remain together as a single unit while moving through the dense trees. During an autumn survey, a German sailor named Tyrkir separates from the main group. The men return to the longhouse and report his absence to Leif. The crew initiates a search operation, carrying burning pine branches to illuminate the forest floor. They locate Tyrkir standing near a dense patch of coastal vegetation. He holds clusters of small, dark purple berries in his bare hands. The men examine the climbing vines and identify them as wild riverbank grapes. These natural grapes measure half an inch in diameter and contain high concentrations of natural sugars. The woody vines grow directly over the lower branches of the local trees, utilizing the taller wood for physical support. Leif observes the vast quantity of these grape clusters growing across the coastal region. He names the entire territory Vinland, translating to wineland in the Old Norse language. The crew spends the subsequent weeks harvesting the dark purple fruit. They gather the berries and store them inside woven wooden baskets within the sod-walled houses. The men cut the thick vines using small iron hand axes and stack them on the ground. The crew spends the winter months living inside the timber halls. The local climate maintains mild temperatures, keeping the air consistently above the freezing point. The topsoil remains soft, allowing the men to walk easily across the meadows without slipping on ice. When the spring season arrives, the men fell additional butternut and maple trees to utilize the cargo capacity of their ship. They strip the bark from the trunks using iron draw knives. The crew carries the heavy, pale timber logs down the grassy terrace to the beach. They load the hardwood timber, the dried vines, and the baskets of wild grapes into the central hold of the canard. The added cargo lowers the waterline of the oak hull by several inches. The crew pushes the heavy vessel off the river stones and back into the bay. They adjust the side rudder and navigate out into the open currents of the Atlantic Ocean. The men use the prevailing southern winds to push the square woolen sail northward. They sail past the forested shores of Markland and the flat stone beaches of Helluland. During the approach to the Greenland coast, the crew spots a rocky reef protruding from the water. They locate 15 shipwrecked Norse sailors stranded on the wet rocks. Leif maneuvers the ship near the reef and brings the stranded men aboard. The heavily loaded vessel arrives at the Eriksfjord settlement. Leif brings the salvaged crew, the timber cargo, and the wild grapes back to the Brattahlid estate. The Greenland colonists inspect the imported hardwood logs and the purple fruit. The returning sailors describe the mild air temperatures and the large salmon runs present in Vinland. The local farmers process this geographical data and recognize the agricultural capacity of the newly mapped territory. An Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni spends the winter months residing at the Brattahlid estate. He purchases the imported timber from the colonists to repair his own trading vessels. Thorfinn gathers the detailed sailing coordinates from Leif and begins organizing a large-scale colonization fleet to return to the Vinland houses in the year 1004. In the spring of the year 1004, the Icelandic merchant Thorfinn Karlsefni gathers 3 trading vessels in the Eriksfjord. Thorfinn organizes a permanent colonization expedition to the Vinland coast. He recruits 160 men and women from the local Greenland settlements. The colonists load the 3 ships with agricultural supplies, seed grain, and heavy iron tools. The men build inclined wooden ramps from the gravel beach to the oak decks of the ships. They drive herds of livestock up the wooden planks. The cargo includes domesticated cattle, pregnant sheep, and breeding pigs. The hooves of the animals step onto the overlapping wooden strakes. The crew builds temporary wooden pens inside the central cargo holds using pine logs. They lash the logs together with braided walrus hide. They spread dried hay and birch leaves over the deck to absorb the animal waste. The sailors load heavy stone drinking troughs and fill them with fresh river water to sustain the animals during the ocean crossing. The crew releases the thick mooring lines and pushes the 3 ships away from the shoreline. The sailors hoist the large square sails made from woven sheep wool. The prevailing eastern winds catch the heavy fabric coated in walrus fat. The fleet sails westward into the open currents of the Labrador Sea. The air temperature over the water drops to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The men and women sit on the wooden rowing benches, wearing thick cloaks spun from raw fleece. The ocean swells lift and drop the oak hulls. The cattle stand inside the pine pens, shifting their weight to maintain balance on the moving deck. The crew members shovel the soiled hay over the side of the ship into the salt water. They continuously feed the livestock with dried grass stored in woven leather sacks. The journey across the open water takes 3 full days. A continuous landmass of flat slate rock appears on the western horizon. Thorfinn navigates the fleet southward, along the coast of the region Leif Erikson designated as Helluland. The 3 ships sail parallel to the shore, utilizing the coastal current. The navigators observe the height of the sun at midday, using a wooden sun compass to calculate their latitude. The flat grey stones transition into a continuous line of dense boreal forest. The fleet passes the black spruce and balsam fir trees of Markland. The steersmen control the heavy wooden side rudders, keeping the vessels at a safe distance from the shallow sandbars. The air temperature gradually rises to 60 degrees Fahrenheit as the ships travel further south. The coastal vegetation changes from coniferous spruce to broadleaf deciduous trees. The crew uses lead-sounding weights tied to hemp ropes to measure the water depth near the shore. They locate the specific river mouth detailed in Leif Erikson's sailing instructions. Thorfinn directs the 3 ships up the freshwater river. The crew navigates into the shallow lake and drops 3 heavy stone anchors into the mud. The men row small wooden boats to the grassy shore and secure heavy mooring lines to the trunks of large maple trees. The settlers construct flat wooden ramps from the ships to the riverbank. They open the pine pens and lead the cattle, sheep, and pigs off the vessels. The animals step onto the wet grass and immediately consume the coastal sedges. The 160 colonists walk inland and locate the timber structures built by Leif Erikson 4 years prior. The site consists of large rectangular halls constructed from hardwood planks and thick blocks of earth. The sod walls show signs of physical decay from the intervening winter seasons. The earthen blocks exhibit deep fissures, and water damage marks the wooden support beams. The settlers extract iron broadaxes and wooden spades from their storage chests. They chop fresh rectangular blocks of topsoil from the surrounding meadow. The workers carry the damp earth to the longhouses and press the new sod blocks into the gaps of the exterior walls. They fell new maple trees to replace the rotting timber roof beams. The crew splits the fresh wood using iron wedges and secures the new beams with wooden pegs driven into holes bored by iron augers. The women gather dry birch branches and ignite fires inside the central stone hearths. The grey smoke rises through the ventilation holes cut into the sod roofs. The heat from the burning wood dries the interior dirt floors. The settlers construct new wooden beds along the walls and fill woven woolen sacks with dry grass to serve as mattresses. The men build a continuous wooden palisade around the perimeter of the camp, using upright butternut trunks. They dig a trench 3 feet deep into the soil and place the logs vertically into the ground. They pack the dirt tightly around the base of the wood to stabilize the defensive wall. Outside the wall, the farmers dig shallow irrigation channels to direct fresh water into the pastures. The cattle and sheep graze on the tall grass, converting the local vegetation into milk and wool. The pigs forage in the nearby broadleaf forest, consuming fallen acorns and digging for edible roots. The men cast woven hemp nets into the river to trap Atlantic salmon. They extract the fish and clean the meat using iron knives. The colonists establish a functional agricultural estate by cultivating the grass, breeding the animals and harvesting the local fish. Thorfinn Karlsefni oversees the daily distribution of the harvested timber and the butchered livestock. His wife, Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, organizes the domestic production inside the longhouses and manages the food preservation for the approaching winter season. Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir organizes the physical labor inside the sod-walled houses of the Vinland settlement. She coordinates the daily food processing for the 160 colonists living on the North American coast. Gudrid spent her early life on the Laugarbrekka estate, a farming settlement located on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula in western Iceland. Her father, Thorbjorn, managed a herd of Icelandic sheep on the volcanic slopes near the ocean. In the year 999, Gudrid and her father sailed west across the Denmark Strait to join the Greenland colonies. Heavy ocean storms fractured the overlapping oak planks of their trading ship. The wooden vessel sank, stranding Gudrid and 14 other passengers on an exposed granite reef in the North Atlantic. Leif Erikson commanded a passing ship and extracted the survivors from the wet rocks. Gudrid relocated to the Brattahlíð estate in Greenland and married the merchant Thorfinn Karlsefni in the year 1002. She boarded his oak trading vessel in the year 1004 to establish the permanent colony in Vinland. Inside the fortified timber palisade, Gudrid implements a strict rationing system to sustain the community through the upcoming winter. The settlers rely on the local ecology and their imported livestock to maintain their caloric intake. The men catch Atlantic salmon in the adjacent freshwater river using weighted hemp nets. They carry the wet fish in woven baskets to the flat wooden tables located outside the longhouses. Gudrid instructs the women to process the fish using small iron knives. The workers slice the salmon open and extract the internal organs. They pack the pink meat into wooden barrels and cover the layers with coarse sea salt. The salt draws the moisture out of the cellular tissue of the fish, inhibiting bacterial reproduction. Hunters travel into the surrounding broadleaf forest to acquire additional protein. They shoot local caribou using wooden bows and arrows fitted with forged iron tips. The men carry the heavy carcasses back to the settlement and place them on the grass. Gudrid oversees the butchering of the animals. The workers strip the thick hide from the muscle using carved bone scrapers. They cut the venison into thin strips and transport the meat into the longhouses. The workers hang the strips of meat on wooden racks constructed from harvested birch branches. The heat radiating from the central stone hearths evaporates the water from the muscle fibers. The grey smoke from the burning wood coats the venison in chemical phenols, preventing rot. Gudrid manages the dairy production using the imported Icelandic cattle. The women milk the cows twice a day in the grassy pastures, collecting the warm liquid in stave-built wooden buckets. They carry the milk into the coolest section of the sod houses and agitate the cream using wooden plungers inside narrow churns. The physical friction separates the butterfat from the buttermilk. The workers press the resulting butter into wooden firkins. They add heavy concentrations of salt to the butter to extend its edibility for several months. The falling autumn temperatures require the production of thick woolen clothing. Gudrid distributes the raw fleece sheared from the imported sheep. The women clean the raw wool using hot water. They heat the water by dropping rocks fired in the stone hearths directly into large wooden vats. The boiling water dissolves the dirt and excess lanolin from the fleece. The workers dry the clean fibers and spin them into yarn using carved soapstone spindle whorls. The heavy soapstone disc maintains the rotational momentum of the wooden spindle, twisting the short wool fibers into a continuous, tight thread. The women construct vertical warp-weighted looms by leaning two tall ash poles against the interior dirt walls of the longhouse. They tie a horizontal wooden beam across the top and hang the vertical warp threads from this upper support. They attach carved steatite stones to the bottom of the threads to maintain constant downward tension. The workers weave the horizontal weft threads back and forth through the tight vertical lines. They pack the threads tightly together using carved whalebone beaters. This continuous physical labor produces heavy wadmal cloth, a dense woolen fabric that repels wind and retains human body heat. The winter season of the year 1004 brings freezing temperatures and heavy snowfall to the Vinland coast. Gudrid maintains the daily distribution of the salted salmon, dried venison, and dense butter. The 160 colonists remain inside the insulated earthen walls, feeding dried hay to their livestock and burning hardwood branches to warm the air. The settlement survives the cold months using the stockpiled resources. The snow melts from the coastal meadows in the spring of the year 1005. Gudrid's physical condition changes over the summer as she prepares to give birth to a child inside the timber longhouse. In the autumn of the year 1005, Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir begins labor inside the main timber longhouse at the Vinland settlement. The air temperature outside the earthen walls drops to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the structure, women pile dried birch branches onto the central stone hearth. The burning wood raises the interior temperature and fills the space with grey smoke. Gudrid lies on a raised wooden bed frame constructed from harvested butternut planks. A mattress, stuffed with dried coastal grass, supports her body. Midwives from the Greenland colony assist with the physical delivery. They use boiled fresh water from the nearby river to clean the sleeping area. The women wipe Gudrid's face with woven wool cloths soaked in the heated water. Gudrid gives birth to a male infant. Thorfinn Karlsefni enters the longhouse and examines the child. They name the boy Snorri Thorfinnsson according to the traditional Icelandic patronymic naming system. The midwives wash Snorri in the warm water and wrap his body in natural white woolen swaddling bands. They wrap the tight fabric strips continuously around the infant's torso and limbs to restrict physical movement and retain core body heat. Snorri is the first documented child of European descent, born on the North American continent. The birth adds a new member to the population of 160 Norse colonists living behind the wooden palisade. Gudrid recovers on the grass mattress for several days following the delivery. She consumes a high-protein diet of boiled Atlantic salmon and roasted caribou meat to support human milk production. She nurses Snorri inside the insulated sod walls. Outside the longhouse, the remaining colonists execute the autumn harvest. The men chop tall meadow grass using long wooden handles fitted with curved iron scythe blades. They swing the heavy blades in wide arcs, cutting the stalks near the soil. The workers stack the wet grass in the sun to dry, turning the piles with wooden pitchforks. This harvested hay feeds the imported Icelandic cattle during the approaching winter months. The women walk into the broadleaf forest to gather the dark purple wild grapes growing on the climbing vines. They carry the fruit back to the settlement in woven willow baskets. The workers press the grapes into wooden vats, using their bare feet. They leave the crushed fruit and juice inside the wooden containers to undergo natural fermentation. The yeast present on the grape skins converts the natural sugars into alcohol, producing wine. The colonists gather fallen walnuts and butternuts from the forest floor. They break the hard outer shells with small river stones and store the calorie-dense nut meats in wooden chests. The men repair the gaps in the longhouse walls before the winter weather arrives. They cut fresh rectangular sod blocks from the meadow using forged iron spades. They press the damp dirt into the exterior walls to block the cold ocean wind. They chop stacks of birch and maple firewood using iron broadaxes, piling the split logs under wooden overhangs to keep the wood dry. The daily operations of the colony continue around the newborn child. Snorri grows larger during the winter months, subsisting entirely on his mother's milk. The snow covers the Vinland meadows from December until March. The air temperature drops below freezing. The colonists keep the cattle, sheep and pigs inside the timber barns to protect them from the cold air. The men shovel the wet animal manure into large piles outside the heavy wooden doors. Snorri survives his first winter inside the heated longhouse. The spring of the year 1006 arrives, melting the snow and exposing the green coastal sedges. The farmers release the livestock into the pastures to consume the fresh vegetation. Snorri spends the first 3 years of his life residing on the coast of Vinland. He learns to walk on the packed dirt floors of the timber halls and the grassy terrace overlooking the bay. He interacts with physical objects scattered around the settlement, holding carved soapstone spindle whorls and wooden boat models crafted by the sailors. Gudrid tailors small garments for him, using the heavy wadmal cloth produced on the vertical warp-weighted looms. She sews the seams using iron needles threaded with spun wool, and fastens the thick tunics using toggles carved from caribou bone. Thorfinn manages the continuous maintenance of the 3 oak ships moored in the freshwater lake. The men replace the frayed walrus hide ropes and scrape the calcified barnacles off the lower hull planks using iron chisels. They apply fresh pine tar to the overlapping oak strakes to seal the wood against water intrusion. The colonists stockpile valuable resources inside the ships for future trade. They fill the cargo holds with harvested timber logs, coiled vines, and animal pelts trapped in the local forest. The physical presence of the growing child establishes the Norse genetic lineage directly on the soil of the new continent, marking a geographical expansion of the European population. During the second summer of the colonization effort, newly arrived watercraft enter the shallow bay. The Norse sentries standing on the grassy terrace observe a group of indigenous North American people paddling small canoes constructed from animal hides stretched over wooden frames. The local inhabitants navigate their lightweight boats through the surf and pull them onto the rounded river stones. The Norse colonists gather their iron axes, steel swords, and wooden shields. The men form a line and walk down the grassy slope to meet the arriving boats on the shoreline. In the summer of the year 1006, 9 canoes approach the Vinland shoreline. The indigenous people navigate the shallow water using carved wooden paddles. The boats consist of animal hides, stretched tightly over frames made of flexible spruce saplings. The boat builders seal the seams with animal fat to block the seawater from entering the hulls. The paddlers guide the vessels onto the rounded river stones of the beach. The occupants step out of the canoes and stand on the wet stones. The men carry wooden bows and quivers filled with arrows tipped with sharpened stone and carved bone. They wear tailored clothing stitched from the thick pelts of local mammals. The Norse colonists stand on the grass above the beach, holding forged iron swords and circular wooden shields clamped with iron rims. The medieval Icelandic scribes, who later record these events on calfskin vellum manuscripts, use the Old Norse word skraeling to identify these indigenous North American groups. The scribes describe the visitors in the texts as possessing dark hair, broad cheeks, and large eyes. The indigenous visitors look up the grassy terrace and inspect the tall wooden palisade encircling the longhouses. They observe the imported Icelandic cattle and sheep grazing in the fenced pastures, animals entirely foreign to the local ecosystem. The two groups maintain a physical distance of several yards along the sloping shore. The indigenous men lower their wooden bows and unroll bundles of animal skins onto the beach stones. The bundles contain the dense winter coats of grey fox, sable, and beaver. The Norse settlers examine the thick fur. European merchants pay high concentrations of silver for intact sable and beaver pelts in the trading ports of Norway and Iceland. Thorfinn Karlsefni walks down the sloping grass to initiate a direct physical exchange of goods. The indigenous traders point to the iron axes and steel swords held by the Norse sailors. They offer the stacks of furs in exchange for the metal tools. Thorfinn issues a direct verbal order to his crew, commanding them to retain all iron weaponry and metal items. He instructs the Norse women to retrieve specific agricultural goods from the longhouses. Gudrid Thorbjarnadóttir and the other women carry wooden buckets filled with cow's milk down to the beach. They also bring long rolls of bright red woolen cloth. The Norse women produce this cloth by weaving spun fleece on the warp-weighted looms and boiling the fabric with the crushed roots of the madder plant to bind the red pigment to the fibers. Thorfinn places the wooden buckets of milk and the rolls of red fabric on the ground between the two groups. The indigenous traders scoop the milk with their hands and consume the white liquid. They examine the dense woven texture and the bright red pigment of the heavy wadmal fabric. The Norse merchants use iron shears to cut the red cloth into smaller physical strips. They trade one span of red cloth for one intact beaver pelt. The indigenous traders accept the exchange, handing over the stacked furs. As the supply of red fabric diminishes, the Norse cut the remaining cloth into increasingly narrow ribbons, measuring less than an inch in width. The indigenous traders continue to exchange full animal pelts for these thin pieces of red wool. They tie the red woolen strips directly around their heads. The physical exchange continues until the Norse completely deplete their supply of dyed cloth and fresh milk. The colonists transfer the acquired sable, fox, and beaver pelts into the central storage compartments of their 3 oak ships. They bundle the pelts tightly, using leather straps, and lower them into the dry cargo holds. The indigenous traders collect their red fabric, pick up their wooden bows, and return to the hide-covered canoes. They push the lightweight boats off the river stones and paddle away into the deeper water of the bay. The summer advances, bringing warm air and heavy rain to the Vinland coast. The grass in the coastal meadows grows tall, providing continuous food for the livestock. The Norse farmers release their herd of cattle from the wooden enclosures to graze in the open fields near the forest edge. The herd includes several mature cows and a large male breeding bull. The bull weighs over 1,000 pounds and features thick neck muscles, dark brown hair, and long curved horns protruding from its skull. The Norse herdsmen monitor the animals during the daylight hours, carrying iron-tipped spears to deter local predators. 3 weeks after the initial trade, a much larger fleet of hide-covered canoes appears on the horizon, navigating steadily across the water toward the settlement beach. The large fleet of hide-covered canoes pulls onto the rounded river stones of the Vinland beach. Dozens of indigenous men step out of the spruce-framed boats onto the wet rocks. They carry heavy bundles of grey fox and beaver pelts across their shoulders. The men walk up the sloping grassy terrace toward the timber longhouses. They approach the wooden palisade to initiate a second exchange of physical goods. The imported Icelandic breeding bull grazes on the tall sedges near the edge of the broadleaf forest. The animal weighs over 1,000 pounds and possesses thick neck muscles and long, curved horns. The bull detects the movement of the large group of humans on the terrace. The animal runs out of the tree line and onto the coastal meadow. The heavy hooves strike the soft soil, tearing the grass roots. Thick white saliva drops from the bull's jaw onto the green sedges. The bull exhales forcefully through its nostrils and produces a loud, vibrating vocalization. The indigenous traders observe the massive brown animal charging across the grass. The local North American ecosystem supports species like caribou and black bears, presenting the domesticated bovine as a completely unfamiliar biological organism. The traders drop their bundles of animal furs directly onto the grass. They run down the sloping terrace and climb into their lightweight canoes. They use carved wooden paddles to push the boats rapidly away from the shore. They row out into the open bay, abandoning the animal pelts on the meadow. 3 weeks pass. The air temperature cools as the month of August ends. A massive fleet of canoes appears on the surface of the bay, forming a continuous line across the water. The occupants hold long wooden poles aloft. The men rotate the poles clockwise, producing a continuous sweeping sound against the wind. The saga of Eric the Red records this specific physical action. Thorfinn Karlsefni observes the rotating poles and issues a direct vocal command to the colonists. The Norsemen retrieve their forged steel swords from oiled leather scabbards. They equip circular wooden shields constructed from overlapping linden wood planks and clamped with heavy iron rims. Thorfinn lifts a shield painted entirely with red iron oxide pigment mixed with walrus fat. The red shield serves as the standard Norse visual signal for armed conflict. The colonists form a horizontal line across the grassy terrace above the beach. The indigenous men step out of the canoes onto the shore. They draw flexible wooden bows and pull the sinew strings backward. They release dozens of arrows tipped with sharpened river stones and carved animal bone. The wooden shafts fly through the air and strike the Norse shields. The stone tips splinter against the overlapping linden wood planks. The Norse men step forward and swing their heavy steel blades. The sharp metal slices through the tailored animal hides and the human tissue underneath. The indigenous fighters deploy a specialized weapon during the clash. They lift a large, dark, spherical object wrapped in animal skin and attached to a long wooden pole. They hurl the heavy sphere high into the air over the heads of the Norse line. The object travels through an aerial trajectory and lands on the grassy soil behind the colonists. The sphere hits the ground and produces a loud concussive sound upon impact. The noise and the aerial bombardment cause the Norse colonists to turn their bodies away from the shoreline. They run up the grassy terrace toward the freshwater river. The indigenous fighters advance up the slope, firing arrows into the retreating group. Thorbrand Snorrason, a Norse settler from the Greenland colony, falls to the dirt floor of the meadow. A flat river stone thrown by an attacker strikes his skull. The dense rock fractures his parietal bone, causing a fatal brain injury. Another colonist, Snorri Thorbrandsson, sustains a deep laceration in his shoulder from a stone projectile. Thorfinn Karlsefni watches the colonists sustain these physical traumas. He shouts orders to continue the retreat up the hill. The Norse men and women sprint toward the settlement walls. They pass through the open wooden gates of the defensive palisade. The colonists push the heavy butternut logs shut. They slide thick iron bars horizontally across the wooden frames to lock the gates. The colonists stand behind the vertical wooden trunks of the palisade. They place their iron-rimmed shields against the wood to brace the walls. The stone-tipped arrows strike the exterior side of the palisade, lodging deeply into the butternut bark. The indigenous fighters remain on the grassy terrace for several hours. They walk around the perimeter of the wooden wall, observing the defensive fortifications. They walk back down the sloping grass to the rounded river stones. They board their hide-covered canoes and paddle outward into the ocean currents. Inside the palisade, the Norse women treat the bleeding wounds using strips of boiled wool and clean river water. They pack the deep lacerations with dry sphagnum moss gathered from the nearby peat bog. The moss absorbs the blood and introduces natural acidic compounds into the wounds to inhibit bacterial infection. The colonists carry the body of Thorbrand Snorrason to a grassy hill overlooking the bay. They dig a rectangular trench into the soil using iron spades. They place his body into the earth and pile heavy field stones over the grave to protect the remains from local scavengers. Thorfinn Karlsefni evaluates the demographic reality of the Vinland settlement. The remaining 159 colonists face a massive local population possessing extensive knowledge of the coastal geography. The physical defense of the timber longhouses requires constant armed vigilance, halting the essential agricultural tasks of harvesting hay and cutting timber. The approaching autumn season of the year 1006 forces the Norse leadership to execute a logistical decision regarding the permanent occupation of the North American coast. In the spring of the year 1007, Thorfinn Karlsefni evaluates the demographic numbers of the Vinland settlement. 159 Norse colonists remain behind the butternut log palisade. The surrounding North American coast supports a large indigenous population possessing established supply lines and navigational control over the coastal waters. Thorfinn instructs the colonists to abandon the timber longhouses. The men dismantle the temporary wooden enclosures used to hold the livestock. They herd the remaining Icelandic cattle, sheep and pigs down the sloping grassy terrace toward the rounded river stones of the beach. The sailors push the 3 54-foot oak trading ships into the shallow water of the bay. They construct flat wooden ramps from the wet stones to the overlapping oak planks of the hulls. The animals walk up the ramps and enter the central cargo holds. The men secure the livestock inside wooden pens tied with walrus hide ropes. The draft of the ships deepens into the water under the weight of the animals. The waterline rises to within 2 feet of the upper wooden railing. The colonists load the physical resources gathered over the previous 3 years. The men carry thick bundles of sable, grey fox, and beaver pelts down the grassy slope. They stack the furs tightly into dry wooden chests to protect the hair fibers from the salt water. The crew rolls dozens of heavy butternut and maple logs onto the lower decks. The Greenland and Iceland landscapes support only low-growing willow shrubs, making the harvested hardwood a high-priced commodity. The women carry woven willow baskets filled with dried wild grapes and salted Atlantic salmon. They place these food rations near the wooden rowing benches to sustain the crew during the ocean crossing. The crew draws fresh water from the river, filling 50-gallon wooden casks. The workers secure the cask lids with pine sap and tie them to the mast support beams to stabilize the center of gravity. Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir walks down the beach, carrying her 3-year-old son, Snorri Thorfinnsson. They board the lead ship and sit on the raw wool blankets placed over the deck planks. The sailors pull the heavy stone anchors up from the mud, using wooden windlasses. They push the oak hulls away from the shoreline using long spruce poles. The crew hoists the large square sails woven from sheep's fleece. The western wind pushes against the walrus fat-coated fabric, moving the three vessels out of the shallow bay. The colonists leave the sod-walled structures and the wooden palisade resting empty on the grassy terrace. The wooden buildings remain exposed to the coastal wind, rain, and dropping autumn temperatures. The fleet sails northward along the coastline, passing the dense boreal forests of Markland and the flat slate beaches of Helluland. The sailors use lead-sounding weights tied to hemp ropes to continuously measure the water depth during the coastal navigation. The navigator relies on a wooden sun compass to maintain the correct latitude heading across the open sea. The air temperature drops from 60 degrees Fahrenheit to 34 degrees Fahrenheit as the ships cross the Davis Strait. The ocean swells crash against the pine tar-sealed hulls, depositing salt crystals on the wooden decks. The three ships arrive at the Eriksfjord settlement in Greenland after several weeks on the open ocean. The colonists disembark onto the gravel beach of the Brattahlid estate. Thorfinn unloads the cargo of animal furs and hardwood timber. He trades a portion of these resources with the local Greenland farmers in exchange for silver rings and fresh provisions. Thorfinn, Gudrid, and Snorri spend one winter inside the stone-walled houses of Greenland. In the summer of the year 1008, they board their ship and sail east across the Denmark Strait toward Iceland. The ocean currents carry the vessel to the northern coast of the volcanic island. They navigate into the Skagafjörður, a deep coastal fjord flanked by steep basalt mountains. Thorfinn exchanges his remaining Vinland timber for a tract of agricultural land called Glaumberg, located in the northern river valley. The family constructs a new farming estate using thick blocks of cut turf. Builders lay a foundation of rounded river stones beneath the turf walls to prevent ground moisture from wicking into the soil blocks. Workers stack the sod blocks in a herringbone pattern to form walls measuring 6 feet thick. The earthen walls insulate the interior rooms against the freezing winter air. The workers construct a central hearth inside the longhouse and burn dried peat gathered from the nearby bogs. Snorri Thorfinnsson grows to adulthood working on the Glaumberg farm. He manages the herds of Icelandic sheep grazing on the steep volcanic slopes. The animals consume the sparse subarctic sedges and produce thick wool fleeces. Snorri shears the wool using forged iron scissors. He oversees the production of heavy wadmal cloth and fermented milk on the estate. The silver acquired from selling the North American resources allows the family to purchase additional livestock and expand their property boundaries. During the early 11th century, Snorri commissions the construction of the first Christian church at the Glaumberg estate. Workers dig a rectangular foundation into the dark volcanic soil. They build the walls using stacked turf and line the interior space with flat wooden planks imported from Norway. The church features a small wooden altar and iron candle holders forged by the local blacksmith. Snorri employs a priest to conduct religious services inside the sod-roofed structure, where the priest reads from Latin manuscripts. Snorri marries and produces offspring, integrating the genetic lineage of the first American-born European into the local Icelandic population. His direct descendants inherit the agricultural lands and become bishops at the Hólar and Skalholt dioceses. These bishops control large tracts of ecclesiastical property across the island. The direct Norse colonization effort on the North American continent concludes entirely with the departure of the three ships in the year 1007. The Norse sailors cease navigating to the specific geographical coordinates of the timber longhouses. The physical descriptions of the sailing routes, The ocean currents and the forested shores transfer into the spoken stories of the Icelandic families. Scribes eventually press iron gall ink into calfskin vellum to record these precise measurements. 200 years after Thorfinn Karlsefni departs the North American coast, agricultural communities in Iceland begin recording the oral accounts of the Vinland voyages onto physical manuscripts. During the early 13th century, men working at ecclesiastical estates in Iceland produce writing parchment from the hides of young domestic cattle. Workers slaughter the calves and remove the skins using forged iron blades. They submerge the fresh hides in wooden vats filled with water and calcium hydroxide. The chemical compound loosens the hair follicles from the dermal tissue over several days. The workers extract the hides from the alkaline bath and drape them over curved wooden beams. They scrape the remaining hair and fat from the skin using curved iron knives, featuring a dull edge. They stretch the wet dermis tightly across rectangular wooden frames using twisted leather cords. As the skin dries in the cold air, the collagen fibers align, creating a flat, taut surface. The workers scrape the dried skin a final time with rough pumice stone to produce a smooth, white writing surface called vellum. They cut the vellum into identical rectangular sheets, measuring roughly 12 by 16 inches, using sharp iron shears. Monks and scribes, sitting inside the turf-walled monasteries, manufacture iron gall ink to write on the prepared vellum. They crush spherical oak galls imported from the European mainland using heavy stone mortars. The crushed galls contain high levels of naturally occurring tannic acid. The scribes boil the crushed galls in rainwater over a peat fire to extract the liquid tannins. They add iron sulfate powder, derived from evaporating groundwater containing iron pyrite, into the tannin solution. The chemical reaction between the tannic acid and the iron sulfate produces a dense, black pigment. The ink makers add dried sap, collected from acacia trees, to the liquid to increase the viscosity and bind the pigment to the writing surface. The scribes collect primary flight feathers, molted from domestic geese. They cut the hollow keratin shaft of the feather using a small, sharp iron blade. They carve a narrow slit at the tip of the quill to draw the liquid ink downward through capillary action. Inside the dark turf houses, the scribes press the inked quill tips onto the white vellum. The iron sulfate physically bonds with the collagen fibers of the skin, permanently staining the material. The scribes write the Old Norse language using the Latin alphabet. They record the precise geographical details and human actions of the North American voyages into two primary manuscript collections. Historians designate these specific texts as the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. The scribes detail the specific sailing times required to cross the open ocean. They write the number of days Bjarni Herjolfsson drifted off course and the exact direction of the prevailing winds. They copy the physical descriptions of Helluland, Markland, and Vinland onto the pages. The scribes describe the exact types of trees harvested on the North American coast, specifically noting the maple and butternut timber. The manuscripts list the names of the 35 sailors who crewed Leif Erikson's ship. The text records the exact trade goods exchanged with the indigenous populations, specifying the red wadmal cloth and the milk from the Icelandic cows. The ink preserves the account of Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir giving birth to Snorri in the timber longhouse. Different scribes produce the Hauksbók manuscript during the first decade of the 14th century. The Hauksbók contains the oldest surviving physical copy of the Saga of Eric the Red. Another group of scribes writes the Flateyjarbók between the years 1387 and 1394. assembling 225 vellum leaves to record the saga of the Greenlanders. The Flateyjarbók represents the largest medieval Icelandic manuscript in existence. The scribes bind the individual vellum sheets together, using leather straps sewn along the left margin to create large, heavy books. They attach thick wooden boards to the front and back of the bound pages to shield the vellum from moisture and physical damage. Icelandic farming families keep these heavy books inside their turf estates. During the winter months, the sun remains below the horizon for 20 hours each day. The families gather inside the central longhouse room to perform daily textile work. They burn fish oil in shallow stone bowls to generate light. The burning oil produces a yellow flame and coats the interior walls with dark soot. One family member reads the ink letters of the sagas aloud to the room, while the others spin wool and knit garments. The acoustic vibrations of the spoken words carry the navigational directions and the names of the distant coastlines across the dark room. These thick vellum books pass through consecutive generations of Icelandic families. In the year 1683, an Icelandic scholar named Árni Magnússon begins collecting the aging vellum manuscripts. He travels across the rural farming districts of Iceland on horseback. He locates vellum pages cut apart by local residents and used to create tailored clothing patterns or to seal gaps in the turf walls against the cold wind. Magnússon purchases the intact books and the damaged fragments using silver coins. Magnússon holds the position of Professor of Danish Antiquities at the university. He packs the manuscripts into wooden crates and transports them on cargo ships across the North Atlantic to Copenhagen, Denmark. The physical manuscripts enter the archives of the University of Copenhagen. The bound manuscripts containing the specific coastal locations of the Vinland settlement rest on wooden shelves inside the Danish library vaults. The sailing coordinates remain documented entirely in the Old Norse language, readable only by a small group of Scandinavian scholars. The physical descriptions of the North American structures exist strictly as black ink pressed into dried animal skins. In the year 1837, a Danish antiquarian named Carl Christian Raffen retrieves these medieval manuscripts from the university archives to translate the vellum pages and map the ancient voyage routes. In the year 1837, Danish scholar Carl Christian Raffen sits at a wooden desk inside the Royal Library in Copenhagen, Denmark. He places the medieval vellum manuscripts containing the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red onto the flat surface. Raffen reads the black iron gall ink pressed into the calfskin pages. The text is written in the Old Norse language. He translates the specific verbs and nouns into Latin and Danish. Raffen corresponds with Finnur Magnússon, an Icelandic scholar residing in Denmark. Magnússon assists Raffen in deciphering the specific linguistic syntax of the 13th century vellum pages. Raffen serves as the secretary for the Royal Society of Northern Antiquaries, an organization dedicated to researching early Scandinavian history. He compiles these translations into a single paper manuscript. Raffen focuses on the nautical measurements recorded by the Icelandic scribes. The texts use the Old Norse term "doiga" to describe a 12-hour period of sailing. Raffen calculates the distance covered by a 54-foot oak knar moving under a steady wind. He estimates one duega equals approximately 150 nautical miles. He opens printed maritime charts of the North American coastline on his desk. He places a brass compass on the coordinates for the southern tip of Greenland. He draws lead lines across the paper maps, following the specific sequence of landfalls described by Leif Erikson. Raffin maps the first landfall, Helluland, to the flat slate beaches of Baffin Island. He traces the route south, along the forested coast of Labrador, matching it to the territory of Markland. Raffin tracks the final sailing route southward to locate Vinland. He correlates the recorded presence of wild riverbank grapes and mild winter temperatures with the physical climate of the eastern seaboard of the United States. He draws a graphite circle around the coastal inlets of Massachusetts and Rhode Island. He identifies the shallow bays and barrier islands of Nantucket Sound and Mount Hope Bay as the exact locations of the temporary timber longhouses built by the Norse colonists. Raffin corresponds directly with Thomas Webb, the secretary of the Rhode Island Historical Society. Webb visits a massive 40-ton boulder located in the shallow water of the Taunton River in Massachusetts, known as Dighton Rock. The tidal water covers the base of the gray sandstone block twice a day. The river water deposits green algae into deep lines carved across the flat surface of the rock. Webb visits the boulder at low tide, using white chalk to trace the carved lines. He transfers the chalk shapes onto paper using a graphite pencil. Webb seals the paper inside an envelope and ships it across the Atlantic Ocean to Denmark. Raffin studies these graphite rubbings in Copenhagen. He compares the pencil sketches to known Scandinavian runic alphabets. He writes a claim stating the carvings on the Dighton Rock represent Norse runes carved by Thorfinn Karlsefni during the year 1008. Raffin also evaluates physical drawings of a stone structure located in Newport, Rhode Island, sent by Webb. The structure consists of an open cylinder built from unshaped fieldstones supported by 8 arches. White mortar holds the fieldstones together. The mortar binding the fieldstones contains crushed oyster shells and sand. Raffin writes that the specific arch dimensions align exactly with 11th century Scandinavian masonry techniques. He states, the Norse colonists constructed the stone tower to serve as a religious baptistry. Raffin prints his research in a physical book titled Antiquitates Americanae in the year 1837. Workers at a Copenhagen printing press arrange small metal typefaces inside wooden frames to form the Latin and Danish words. They apply black carbon ink to the raised metal letters using leather rollers. They press damp cotton rag paper onto the inked type using a heavy iron hand press. The printing press uses a screw mechanism operated by a long wooden lever. The workers turn the lever to apply continuous downward pressure on the platen, transferring the ink directly onto the cotton fibers. The resulting book features 526 pages and includes engraved copperplate maps of the Atlantic Ocean. Bindery workers sew the printed paper sections together using heavy linen thread. They bind the book in dark calfskin leather and stamp the title Antiquitates Americanae onto the spine using heated brass tools and gold leaf. The Royal Society packs the thick, bound volumes into wooden crates. Cargo ships transport the crates across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States. Couriers deliver the books to academic institutions, including the Library of the Rhode Island Historical Society in Providence and the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston. American scholars read the Latin text and examine the copperplate maps detailing the Norse sailing routes. The publication of Antiquitates Americanae initiates a period of physical excavation along the eastern seaboard of the United States. Local citizens in Massachusetts and Rhode Island purchase iron shovels and dig into the topsoil of coastal farms. Amateur historians rent horse-drawn wagons to travel to coastal inlets. They carry measuring chains and wooden stakes to mark grid lines on the sandy soil. They excavate deep trenches near the Taunton River, removing layers of brown topsoil and white quartz sand. They sift the dirt through wire mesh screens, separating small rocks and broken clamshells from the earth. Residents walk along the beaches of Narragansett Bay and Cape Cod, visually inspecting the ground for rusted iron tools, bronze cloak pins, or decayed oak ship timbers. Newspapers in Boston print columns of black ink summarizing Raffin's geographical claims. Printing presses in New York City distribute English-language pamphlets detailing the exact coordinates of the proposed Vinland settlements. The wide circulation of the Antiquitates Americanae text introduces the specific name of Leif Erikson to the general American population. Scandinavian immigrants residing in the United States purchase translated copies of the book. These citizen groups organize local committees to collect paper currency and silver coins from their communities. They hire sculptors and purchase large quantities of bronze and granite to construct public monuments honoring the newly publicized Norse voyages. In the year 1873, a Norwegian musician named Ole Bull travels to Boston, Massachusetts. He holds town meetings inside brick public halls. He collects paper currency and silver coins from local citizens. He organizes a committee of Scandinavian immigrants residing in the United States of America to fund a public monument. The committee signs a paper contract with an American sculptor named Anne Whitney to design a statue of Leif Erikson. Whitney works inside her physical studio, located in Belmont, Massachusetts. She builds an internal structural armature using iron pipes and wooden planks. She applies wet gray clay over the iron frame, pressing the cold material with her bare fingers and carved wooden modeling tools. She shapes the heavy clay into the physical form of a Norse sailor standing 10 feet tall. She sculpts the right hand, shielding the eyes, depicting the figure looking directly westward. She carves specific historical details into the clay surface, including a chainmail shirt composed of individual metal rings and a thick studded leather belt. Workers at a bronze foundry transport the finished clay model into their industrial casting room. They coat the wet clay with liquid white plaster to create a rigid negative mold. They extract the clay and pour molten wax into the dried plaster mold to create a hollow wax replica of the sailor. The workers cover the wax shell with a wet mixture of fine sand and liquid silica. They place the coated figure inside a brick kiln heated by burning coal. The extreme heat melts the internal wax, leaving a hollow space inside the hardened sand shell. The foundry workers melt solid bronze ingots inside a graphite crucible at a temperature of 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit. They pour the glowing liquid copper and tin alloy directly into the hollow sand mold. The metal cools and solidifies over a period of several days. The workers break the sand shell using iron hammers to reveal the solid bronze statue. They polish the dark metal using wire brushes. They apply acidic chemical solutions to the exterior surface to accelerate the oxidation of the copper. On October 29, 1887, draft horses pull a flat wooden wagon carrying the bronze statue through the paved streets of Boston. Workers lift the heavy metal figure using thick hemp ropes and wooden pulleys. They secure the bronze statue onto a carved red sandstone pedestal located at the western end of Commonwealth Avenue. A crowd of citizens stands on the surrounding brick pavement to observe the installation. Water flows continuously through a sculpted bronze longship placed at the base of the pedestal, draining into a semicircular granite basin. During that same year, a woman named Mrs. Joseph T. Gilbert funds the production of a second, identical bronze casting. Foundry workers replicate the lost wax casting process using Whitney's original plaster molds to pour a duplicate metal figure. Workers load the second bronze statue onto a steam-powered freight train. The heavy locomotive burns black coal to heat its iron water boiler. The boiling water generates high-pressure steam to push the iron pistons and move the steel wheels westward across the continent. The train arrives at a rail yard in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Workers transport the bronze figure using a horse-drawn cart to Juneau Park. The park sits directly on the western shore of Lake Michigan, a massive deep-water freshwater lake. In November of the year 1887, Milwaukee city officials bolt the bronze Leif Erikson statue to a block of gray granite. They orient the physical statue so the face looks eastward over the open water of the lake. Local residents gather on the cut green grass of the park to view the physical installation. The physical production of these bronze statues relies on the coordinated labor of hundreds of individuals. Bank clerks process the thousands of dollars in paper notes collected by the committees. Foremen distribute these funds to pay the foundry workers, railway operators, and stonemasons. The physical monuments stand permanently exposed to the seasonal weather patterns of the North American continent. Rainwater washes over the bronze surfaces, reacting chemically with the copper to form a green patina of copper carbonate. Snow accumulates on the sculpted bronze shoulders during the winter months. City planners in Chicago, Illinois, and Seattle, Washington, observe the installation of these monuments and commission their own bronze statues of Norse sailors during the subsequent decades. Mail carriers deliver printed daily newspapers containing physical descriptions of these new statues to rural agricultural communities. Scandinavian immigrants purchase paper deeds for tracts of farmland across the American Midwest. These settlers cut down the dense native timber using forged iron axes. They plow the dark prairie soil using heavy steel blades pulled by draft horses. They plant seeds of wheat and oats in the turned earth. In the late summer of the year 1898, a Swedish immigrant named Olof Öhman walks into a wooded area on his property in Douglas County, Minnesota, carrying an iron axe and a wooden spade to uproot a poplar tree. In August of the year 1898, a Swedish immigrant named Olof Öhman clears trees on his farm in Douglas County, Minnesota. He uses an iron axe and a steel grub hoe to remove the native vegetation. He targets an aspen tree measuring 10 inches in diameter. He digs into the dark topsoil and cuts the thick wooden roots. Under the root system, his steel blade strikes a solid object. He uses a wooden lever to pry the object from the soil. He extracts a rectangular slab of grey-wacke stone. The rock measures 30 inches long, 16 inches wide, and 6 inches thick. It weighs 202 pounds. The roots of the aspen tree wrap completely around the stone, flattening against the hard mineral surface. Öhman's 10-year-old son, Edward, notices marks on the flat face of the rock. Öhman brushes the damp brown dirt away, using his bare hands. He reveals 9 rows of carved characters cut into the grey surface. 3 additional rows cover the side edge of the stone. The characters feature straight vertical lines and sharp diagonal branches. These shapes match the runic alphabets used in medieval Scandinavia. Öhman loads the heavy stone onto a wooden wagon pulled by draft horses. He drives the wagon into the nearby town of Kensington. He places the stone on display inside the front glass window of the local bank. Residents walk along the wooden sidewalks to look at the carved rock. A local businessman makes a paper copy of the carvings. He presses a sheet of paper against the stone and rubs a graphite pencil over the grooves. He mails the paper to the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. Professor Olaus Breda receives the envelope. Breda teaches Scandinavian languages at the university. He translates the carved characters. The text describes an expedition of 8 Swedes and 22 Norwegians traveling westward from Vinland. The carvings specify the date of the journey as the year 1362. Breda examines the specific vocabulary and grammatical structure of the inscribed words. The text uses the word opdagelsefard, a modern Scandinavian term for a journey of discovery invented during the 19th century. The grammar matches the specific rural Swedish dialect spoken in the Dalarna region during the late 1800s. Olof Öhman emigrated directly from the Dalarna region. Breda writes a formal letter stating the carved characters represent a modern creation produced using 19th century steel tools. Other university linguists examine the text and confirm Breda's linguistic analysis. The physical chisel marks inside the grooves expose the lighter, unweathered interior of the Greywacke stone. This exposed interior contrasts sharply with the dark, oxidized exterior surface of the rock. Öhman retrieves the Greywacke slab from the bank. He carries the stone back to his farm and places it face down near his granary door. He uses the flat back of the rock as an anvil to straighten bent iron nails with a steel hammer. In the year 1907, a Norwegian-American historian named Hjalmar Holland visits the Öhman farm. Holland purchases the stone for $10. Holland transports the 200-pound slab across the United States of America. He exhibits the rock at civic halls and historical societies. Scandinavian immigrants living in the American Midwest pay silver coins to view the physical object. The text on the stone directly connects their 19th century agricultural settlements to the medieval Norse voyages. Holland publishes books and prints articles in regional newspapers defending the antiquity of the carvings. In the year 1948, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, District of Columbia, places the Greywacke stone on public display. Museum technicians mount the heavy rock on a steel pedestal inside the National Museum of Natural History. Thousands of visitors walk across the marble floors to view the runic inscriptions. Linguists and runologists continuously publish academic papers detailing the 19th century origins of the carved letters. The public display of the rock fuels a widespread cultural desire to physically locate the genuine medieval Norse settlements. Committees in Minnesota erect a massive fiberglass replica of the runestone in the town of Alexandria. They build a brick museum to house the original Greywacke slab. Professional archaeologists shift their search parameters back to the eastern coastal environments. The original Icelandic vellum manuscripts specifically describe the Norse navigating saltwater ocean currents, catching Atlantic salmon and building timber houses near a shallow bay. In the year 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and a professional archaeologist named Anne Stine Ingstad organize an expedition. They board a boat and sail along the rugged, ice-scraped coastline of Newfoundland, Canada. They rely on the physical landscape descriptions recorded by the 13th century scribes to guide their search for the Vinland colony. In the spring of the year 1960, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and archaeologist Anne Stine Ingstad traveled to the North American coast. They board a motorized wooden boat and navigate northward along the rugged shoreline of Newfoundland, Canada. The boat features a diesel engine that spins a bronze propeller, pushing the wooden hull through the cold waters of the Labrador Sea. Helge Ingstad reads the Old Norse texts, translated into modern Norwegian. He uses the specific geographical descriptions recorded in the saga of the Greenlanders to plot his physical course. The medieval text dictates a search for a shallow bay, a grassy terrace, and a freshwater river flowing directly into the ocean. The Ingstads steer their vessel into deep coastal fjords and stop at isolated fishing villages. The physical journey requires navigating through dense fog banks generated by the meeting of the cold Labrador Current and the warm Gulf Stream. The sailors use heavy lead weights tied to hemp ropes to continuously measure the water depth and avoid submerged granite reefs. They dock the boat against wooden piers built from rough spruce logs. They walk onto the wet wooden docks and speak directly with the local cod fishermen. Helga asks the residents to identify the locations of old stone ruins or overgrown dirt mounds. The fishermen point toward various rock formations and indigenous settlements distributed along the coast. The Ingstads investigate these specific locations on foot. They find the remnants of 19th-century whaling stations and indigenous summer camps containing broken clamshells and fire-cracked rocks. The boat travels further north along the Great Northern Peninsula of Newfoundland. The coastal topography shifts from steep granite cliffs to flat grey slate beaches backed by dense black spruce forests and low grassy meadows. In the late summer of the year 1960, the Ingstads arrive at a small fishing village called L'Anse aux Meadows. The village sits on the extreme northern tip of the peninsula, facing the open ocean currents of the Strait of Belle Isle. The ocean water temperature measures 40 degrees Fahrenheit. A local resident named George Decker greets the Norwegian explorers on the gravel beach. Decker wears thick wool clothing to block the cold sea wind blowing from the north. Helga Ingstad approaches Decker and asks him about unusual mounds in the local landscape. Decker nods and describes a specific grassy terrace located a short distance down the coastline. Decker leads Helga and Anne Stein away from the gravel beach. They walk overland through tall coastal sedges and low-growing willow shrubs. The ground beneath their heavy leather boots consists of damp, sandy soil. They approach a shallow body of water known as Epaves Bay. A small freshwater river flows out of the mainland and empties directly into the salt water of the bay. The group steps onto a raised marine terrace positioned 10 feet above the high tide line. A wet peat bog borders the terrace to the east. The bog contains deep layers of decaying sphagnum moss and pools of stagnant brown water. Decker points his hand toward the green grass, covering the flat ground of the terrace. The Ingstads observe a series of raised linear ridges covered in sod and wild vegetation. The ridges form distinct rectangular shapes on the surface of the meadow. The largest rectangular outline measures over 70 feet in length and 20 feet in width. Anne Stein Ingstad kneels on the damp grass to examine the physical dimensions of the mounds. She traces the straight lines of the raised earth using her bare hands. She recognizes the specific architectural layout of the ruins. The rectangular proportions match the medieval turf longhouses built by Norse colonists in Iceland and Greenland during the 11th century. The mounds represent the collapsed earthen walls of large timber-framed structures. Centuries of coastal rain and heavy snow accumulation eroded the original cut-sod blocks into smooth, rounded hills. Helga Ingstad observes the surrounding topography. He sees the freshwater river running through the terrace, the shallow bay extending into the ocean, and the forested hills located inland. The physical environment aligns precisely with the sailing coordinates and geographical markers detailed in the medieval vellum manuscripts describing Vinland. The Ingstads establish a temporary camp on the meadow near the mounds. They erect canvas tents and secure them to the ground using iron stakes. They unpack iron shovels and steel hand trowels from their canvas bags. Anne Stein uses a wooden peg and a spool of white cotton string to mark a straight test line across the largest rectangular mound. She cuts into the green turf using a flat-edged steel spade. She lifts the top layer of grass and exposes the dark brown soil underneath. The metal blade of the spade strikes a hard layer of compacted earth 2 feet below the surface. This compacted dirt forms the original interior floor of the structure. Anne Stein scrapes the loose topsoil away using a small steel hand trowel. She reveals a central linear depression running down the middle of the floor plan. The depression contains heavy concentrations of black wood charcoal and heat-fractured river stones. This feature represents a long hearth used for burning wood to heat the interior space. The Ingstads collect the charcoal pieces and seal them inside small glass jars. They record the exact depth and location of the charcoal layers in a paper notebook using graphite pencils. They pack their tools and the glass jars into their wooden boat. They navigate the vessel away from Lanso Meadows and return to Norway at the end of the year 1960. They send the charcoal samples to a scientific laboratory in Trondheim for radiocarbon dating. The workers in the laboratory clean the charcoal using acidic chemical washes to remove modern root contaminants. They convert the carbon into a gas and count the radioactive emissions using specialized electronic sensors. The scientific analysis dates the burned wood to the early 11th century. Anne Steen Ingstad uses this physical data to organize an international archaeological team and prepare for a comprehensive excavation of the 8 visible structures resting on the Epaves Bay Terrace. In the summer of the year 1961, Anne Steen Ingstad returns to the grassy terrace at Epaves Bay. She brings an international team of professional archaeologists from Norway, Sweden, Iceland, and Canada. The workers pitch canvas tents on the coastal meadow near the freshwater river. They establish a physical grid over the 8 rectangular mounds using wooden stakes and white cotton string. They measure the grid squares in 1-meter increments to track the exact coordinates of the extracted material. The archaeologists kneel on the damp soil and cut the sod using forged steel trowels. They place the loose dirt into galvanized metal buckets. They carry the heavy buckets to the edge of the site and pour the soil through wire mesh screens. The metal mesh separates small fragments of charcoal and stone from the dark earth. The excavation continues for 7 consecutive summer seasons, concluding in the year 1968. The workers remove thousands of cubic feet of topsoil to expose the continuous floor plans of 8 separate structures. The team identifies 3 large multi-room dwellings and 5 smaller single-room buildings. The spatial layout groups the buildings into 3 distinct complexes situated along the raised marine terrace. The largest building, designated as Hall F, measures 72 feet in length and 45 feet in width. The excavators uncover rows of circular dark stains in the yellow clay floor. These stains represent the decayed organic remnants of vertical timber posts. The original builders drove these thick wooden columns into the ground to support the heavy sod roof. The exterior walls consist of layers of cut peat block, measuring up to 6 feet thick. The architectural dimensions and internal room divisions match the exact construction techniques used at 11th century Norse estates in Iceland and Greenland. Inside the exposed longhouses, the team unearths long central fire pits lined with flat river stones. The archaeologists collect grey ash and charred birchwood from these open hearths. They locate smaller ember pits, used to keep fires burning overnight without consuming large amounts of fuel. The excavators find large stone boiling pits cut deeply into the dirt floor near the hearths. The Norse colonists filled these lined pits with fresh water and dropped heated rocks directly into the liquid to boil cuts of meat. The team uncovers raised earthen platforms running continuously along the interior walls. The medieval inhabitants used these flat benches for sleeping and processing raw textiles. The archaeologists document the specific placement of every stone and post hole on large sheets of graphing paper using graphite pencils. During the excavation of the terrace, workers dig a trench near the edge of the peat bog. They uncover the stone foundation of a small, semi-subterranean hut cut directly into the sloping bank of the stream. The interior of the hut contains a large, flat stone embedded securely in the dirt floor. The archaeologists identify this flat rock as a blacksmith's anvil. The soil surrounding the anvil contains dense concentrations of black iron slag, charred wood, and pieces of roasted iron ore. The physical presence of slag confirms the execution of iron smelting at the site. This small stone forge represents the earliest documented location of iron production on the North American continent. The Norse colonists produced this iron by harvesting specific physical resources from the adjacent wetland. The peat bog holds slow-moving water containing high levels of dissolved iron extracted from the surrounding bedrock. Bacteria in the water oxidize the iron, creating solid red clusters of limonite known as bog iron. The Norse workers waded into the cold water and pulled the heavy lumps of bog iron from the mud using their bare hands. They piled the wet ore onto dry ground and lit wood fires directly over the piles to roast the material. The heat evaporated the trapped moisture and burned away the organic impurities. The blacksmiths transported the roasted ore into the small stone hut. They constructed a vertical shaft furnace using packed clay and flat field stones. They filled the cylindrical furnace with alternating layers of crushed bog iron and wood charcoal. A worker pumped a pair of leather bellows attached to a ceramic tube located at the base of the furnace. The continuous flow of forced oxygen ignited the charcoal and raised the internal temperature to 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit. The intense heat caused the iron oxide to react physically with the carbon monoxide gas produced by the burning charcoal. The chemical reaction stripped the oxygen from the ore, leaving a porous mass of solid iron known as a bloom. The liquid silicate impurities melted and flowed out of the bottom of the clay furnace, cooling into the black, glassy slag pieces found by the archaeologists. The blacksmith removed the hot iron bloom from the clay furnace using iron tongs. He placed the glowing mass onto the flat stone anvil. He struck the hot metal repeatedly with a heavy iron hammer to compress the solid iron and expel the remaining pockets of liquid slag. The blacksmith shaped the purified iron into thin metal rods. He cut the rods and hammered the ends to forge iron boat rivets. The Norse sailors required these specific metal fasteners to replace broken rivets in the overlapping oak planks of their cargo ships. The entire physical smelting operation produced a limited quantity of iron, measuring roughly 6 pounds of usable metal. The physical excavation at Lonso Meadows provides concrete material evidence of the Norse voyages recorded in the medieval Icelandic sagas. The archaeologists pack their graphing paper notes, the bags of iron slag, and the collected artifacts into wooden crates to transport them back to scientific museums in Canada and Norway. While the scientists sift through the coastal dirt of Newfoundland during the middle of the 1960s, antiquarian book dealers in Europe transport a folded piece of parchment containing black ink to Yale University in the United States of America, initiating a different physical investigation into medieval cartography. In the year 1957, an American antiquarian book dealer named Lawrence Whitten purchases a bound volume from a private library in Geneva, Switzerland. Whitten examines the physical volume. The book features a leather cover containing a religious manuscript called the Historia Tartarorum. Folded inside the cover rests a separate sheet of animal skin parchment measuring 11 by 16 inches. Black ink lines cross the flat surface of the parchment, forming a cartographic map of the world. The drawn coastlines outline the continents of Europe, Africa, and Asia. In the upper left quadrant of the parchment, the ink outlines two large islands situated in the North Atlantic Ocean. The first island matches the geographical shape of Greenland. The second island lies further west and features three distinct coastal inlets. A Latin inscription written in black ink above this western landmass labels the territory as Vinland. The handwritten text explicitly details a voyage undertaken by Bjarni Herjolfsson and Leif Erikson to this western coast. Whitten transports the parchment across the Atlantic Ocean to the USA. He presents the document to curators at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. An American philanthropist named Paul Mellon purchases the map using private funds and donates the physical parchment to the university library. Curators place the document inside a climate-controlled vault to regulate the ambient humidity and temperature. On October 11, 1965, administrators at Yale University hold a press conference inside a brick academic building. They place the parchment on a wooden table under electric lights. They announce the physical existence of the Vinland map to the attending journalists. Yale University Press simultaneously publishes a printed book containing photographs of the parchment and Latin translations of the handwritten text. The publication of the map generates immediate physical examination by cartographic scholars. Researchers look closely at the physical holes piercing the animal skin. Certain insects consume parchment, leaving distinct cylindrical wormholes through the pages. The physical holes in the map align precisely with matching wormholes found in a separate 15th century manuscript known as the Speculum Historiale. This physical alignment confirms the blank parchment itself originates from the middle of the 1400s. Scholars examine the black ink forming the coastlines and the Latin letters. The ink features a black central line flanked by yellowish-brown edges. This specific visual pattern mimics the natural physical degradation of medieval iron gall ink, where the iron sulfate slowly leaches outward into the collagen fibers of the parchment over 5 centuries. In the year 1973, physical chemists initiate a microscopic analysis of the ink covering the parchment. A scientist named Walter McCrone extracts microscopic particles from the black lines. He presses small squares of clear adhesive tape directly against the surface of the map. He pulls the tape away, lifting tiny fragments of the ink onto the adhesive. He places these tape samples onto flat glass slides. He mounts the slides under a polarized light microscope inside a laboratory in Chicago, Illinois. He directs focused light beams through the glass lenses to magnify the physical structure of the ink particles by a factor of 1,000. McCrone observes small yellowish crystals suspended within the ink binder. He measures the specific refractive index of these crystals as the light passes through them. In the subsequent decades, researchers transport the map to additional scientific laboratories for elemental analysis. Chemists place the parchment inside a vacuum chamber. They use a scanning electron microscope to bombard the ink surface with a concentrated beam of electrons. The electrons strike the atoms within the ink, causing the material to emit specific X-ray signatures. Detectors measure these X-ray wavelengths to identify the exact chemical elements present on the parchment. The elemental data displays a massive concentration of titanium present in the yellowed edges of the ink lines. The researchers map the distribution of the titanium, matching it perfectly to the drawn coastlines and Latin letters. In the year 2002, chemists at University College London conduct additional physical tests on the map using Raman spectroscopy. They direct a focused green laser beam onto the surface of the parchment. The laser light hits the chemical molecules in the ink. The molecules scatter the light, shifting the energy of the photons based on their specific chemical bonds. A spectrometer measures these scattered wavelengths to create a unique molecular fingerprint. The resulting graph displays a sharp peak at exactly 144 wave numbers. This specific measurement represents the precise molecular vibration of synthetic anatase titanium dioxide. The laser confirms the anatase exists throughout the entirety of the map's ink lines, including the letters spelling the word Vinland. The chemists evaluate the physical crystal structure of the titanium. They identify the substance as anatase, a specific crystalline form of titanium dioxide. Medieval scribes manufactured iron gall ink using crushed oak galls, iron sulfate, and tree sap. This medieval formulation contains exclusively carbon, iron, and tannic acid. Industrial chemists first synthesized anatase titanium dioxide in a laboratory setting in the year 1923. Paint manufacturers added this synthesized white powder to commercial paints and inks during the 1920s to increase opacity. The physical presence of synthetic anatase crystals embedded directly inside the ink lines establishes the exact timeline of the map's creation. The creator of the document acquired a blank sheet of authentic 15th century parchment. The individual drew the coastlines of Europe, Greenland, and Vinland using a modern ink formulation containing synthetic anatase. The forger drew a yellow line of titanium dioxide alongside the black carbon ink to simulate the chemical bleeding typical of aged iron gall ink. The scientific community reviews the electron microscopy data and classifies the Vinland map entirely as a 20th century forgery. The researchers return the parchment to the storage vault at Yale University. While chemists analyze the synthetic titanium crystals under electric microscopes in the USA, the International Archaeological Team in Newfoundland uses steel trowels to extract authentic physical objects from the dirt floors of the timber longhouses at Lanceau Meadows. In the summer of the year 1968, the International Archaeological Crew continues excavating the dirt floors at the Lanceau Meadows site in Newfoundland, Canada. The archaeological team uses forged steel trowels to systematically remove the dirt from the floor of the largest timber-framed structure, designated on the site map as Hall F. They work in precise 1-meter grid squares, separated by white cotton string. The workers measure the exact depth and horizontal coordinates of every uncovered artifact, using wooden rulers and brass plumb bobs. They record these physical measurements in paper notebooks using graphite pencils. A metal blade uncovers a small green object resting in the compacted yellow clay near the central stone hearth. The archaeologist extracts the item from the dirt using wooden tweezers. The object is a ring-headed pin measuring 4 inches in length. A small circular ring passes through a hole drilled directly into the top of the metal shaft. Norse metalworkers in 10th century Scandinavia cast these specific pins by pouring molten copper and tin into clay molds. Norse sailors used these rigid metal pins to fasten heavy woolen cloaks around their shoulders to block the cold ocean winds. The wet coastal soil of Epaves Bay reacted chemically with the copper over 9 centuries. The soil water deposited oxygen and carbon atoms onto the metal, coating the pin in a green layer of copper carbonate. This chemical barrier protected the interior copper and tin alloy from total structural degradation. Workers placed the oxidized bronze pin inside a padded wooden box to secure the metal object. In another section of the excavated terrace, excavators dig a trench near the sod walls of a smaller building. They load the dark brown topsoil into galvanized metal buckets and carry the buckets to a sifting station. They pour the dirt through a metal mesh screen. A circular piece of grey stone remains on the wire grid. The object is a spindle whorl, carved from solid soapstone, a metamorphic rock, also known as steatite. The stone disc measures 1.5 inches in diameter and features a central hole bored entirely through the rock. Norse women placed these heavy stone discs at the bottom of carved wooden spindles. A worker held the raw wool in one hand and spun the stick with the other hand. The dense mass of the soapstone maintained the rotational momentum of the wooden stick. The spinning stick twisted short sheep fleece fibers together, binding the raw wool into a continuous, strong thread. The workers gathered hundreds of yards of this spun thread. They tied the threads to the vertical wooden beams of warp-weighted looms to weave heavy wadmal cloth. The physical presence of the soapstone spindle whorl establishes the concrete labor of women producing textiles at the North American settlement. The archaeological team unearths 99 broken iron boat rivets scattered across the grassy terrace. The iron fasteners show severe rust degradation from continuous exposure to ground moisture. The Norse sailors discarded these broken rivets while repairing the overlapping oak planks of their cargo ships on the nearby beach. The shipwrights placed the ships on the wet sand of the beach. They cut away the rusted iron fasteners using steel chisels struck by heavy iron mallets. They inserted newly forged iron rivets produced in the stone forge and hammered the ends flat to secure the oak planks. The archaeologists locate a small whetstone carved from grey quartzite near the scattered iron fragments. The flat surface of the whetstone shows deep linear scratch marks from Norse workers sharpening iron sewing needles. The team extracts a fragmented needle carved from animal bone from the same soil layer. The colonists used this bone needle for stitching leather shoes and repairing torn animal hides. The workers place the iron rivets, the quartzite whetstone, and the bone needle into clear glass vials for transport. The team digs test pits into the peat bog located directly east of the timber structures. The acidic water of the bog creates an anaerobic environment, halting the biological decay of organic materials. The thick layers of wet sphagnum moss trap fallen debris and separate the submerged items from the atmospheric oxygen. The excavators pull fragments of cut wood from the wet brown moss. Botanists analyze the cellular structure of these wood fragments under light microscopes inside a laboratory. The scientists cut thin slices of the wood using steel razor blades and place them on flat glass slides. They identify several pieces as butternut wood, scientifically classified as Juglans cinerea. Butternut trees grow strictly in regions south of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The northernmost native range of the butternut tree exists in modern New Brunswick, Canada. The physical presence of the cut butternut wood indicates the Norse sailors navigated their oak ships further south along the North American coast to harvest broadleaf hardwood timber. The workers also extract thick strips of birch bark rolled tightly together. The Norse fishermen tied these birch bark rolls to woven hemp fishing nets to serve as buoyant floats in the ocean water. The physical excavation at Lonso Meadows concludes exactly 7 years after Anne Stein Ingstad cut the first sod block in 1961. The workers pack the artifacts into wooden shipping crates filled with shredded paper to absorb mechanical shocks during transport. Cargo ships transport the wooden crates containing the artifacts across the Atlantic Ocean. Museum curators place the physical objects on glass shelves inside the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo, Norway, and the Room's Provincial Museum in St. John's, Newfoundland. The physical dimensions of the bronze pin and the carved soapstone match the exact tools manufactured by Norse colonists living in Greenland and Iceland during the 11th century. These concrete objects validate the actions recorded by the Icelandic scribes in the medieval vellum sagas. Thorfinn Karlsefni and Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir transported these specific metal and stone tools across the Labrador Sea. The Norse colonists departed the North American continent, leaving these physical items buried in the dirt. They also brought biological material back across the ocean. The colonists carried human genetic sequences acquired during their interactions with the indigenous North American populations. Scientists locate these specific molecular structures inside the blood of living humans centuries later. In the year 2010, a team of geneticists extracts liquid blood samples from modern citizens residing in Iceland to track this precise genetic lineage. In the year 2010, geneticists working at a laboratory in Reykjavik, Iceland, extract liquid blood samples from modern citizens. The scientists use hypodermic needles made of stainless steel to puncture the median cubital vein in the human arm. They draw the warm red blood into vacuum-sealed glass tubes. They place the glass tubes inside a mechanical centrifuge. An electric motor spins the rotor at 3,000 revolutions per minute. The centrifugal force pulls the heavy red blood cells to the bottom of the tube and leaves the clear liquid plasma at the top. The scientists extract mitochondrial deoxyribonucleic acid, commonly written as DNA, from the cellular material. Mitochondria exist as small organelles inside human cells. They consume oxygen and glucose to generate adenosine triphosphate, the chemical compound powering human cellular functions. Mothers pass their mitochondrial DNA directly to their biological children. The molecular sequence remains intact across consecutive generations, accumulating specific chemical mutations at a mathematically predictable rate. The laboratory workers run the extracted genetic material through automated sequencing machines. These machines use fluorescent chemical dyes to label the 4 nucleotide bases of the genetic code, specifically adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. Lasers read the colored light emitted by the dyes. Digital optical sensors convert the physical light waves into data stored on a computer server. The researchers analyze the digital genome sequences of hundreds of Icelandic citizens. They identify a specific genetic lineage designated as C1e in the genomes of exactly 80 individuals living in modern Iceland. Biological anthropologists use similar sequencing techniques to map the global distribution of human mitochondrial lineages. The C1e haplogroup belongs to a larger genetic family originating exclusively within the indigenous populations of the Americas. The native populations of Europe and Asia possess entirely different nucleotide sequences. The researchers cross-reference the names of the 80 individuals with a comprehensive digital database containing the written genealogical records of the Icelandic population. For centuries, church priests and census takers recorded family births, marriages, and deaths using iron gall ink on paper ledgers. The digital database traces the maternal ancestry of all 80 living individuals back through these paper records to 4 specific women. These 4 women lived in different coastal farming districts of Iceland during the early 18th century. They engaged in the standard physical labor of the era, processing raw wool and preparing salted fish inside turf-walled houses. The researchers calculate the mutation rate of the mitochondrial genome to determine the exact century the sequence entered the Icelandic population. They count the specific number of base pair changes separating the modern Icelandic samples from the original indigenous American genetic line. The mathematical calculation indicates the C1e lineage arrived in Iceland around the year 1000. This date coincides exactly with the decade the Norse colonists navigated their oak cargo ships back across the Atlantic Ocean from the Vinland settlement. The genetic data indicates an indigenous North American woman traveled aboard one of the 54-foot wooden ships. She crossed the cold Labrador Sea and the Davis Strait. She arrived at the stone and turf estates of the Norse colonies. She consumed the local diet of boiled Atlantic salmon and fermented cow's milk. She gave birth to female children on the volcanic island. Her daughters inherited her specific mitochondrial DNA sequence. They passed the genetic material forward through 1,000 years of continuous human reproduction. The descendants of this woman worked on the agricultural estates along the deep coastal fjords. They sheared imported sheep using forged iron scissors and gathered dried peat from the bogs for the central hearth fires. They endured the dropping atmospheric temperatures of the Little Ice Age, a period of regional cooling that expanded the coastal glaciers. They survived outbreaks of the bubonic plague, a bacterial infection transmitted by fleas. The microscopic genetic code remained stable inside their cellular fluid through dozens of successive generations. The DNA replicated physically inside the cells of each new child, transporting the precise sequence of adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine from the North American continent into the modern era. While the geneticists sequence human blood in the laboratories of Reykjavik, other scientists execute a different physical analysis on the chopped wood collected from the Lonsor Meadows excavation site in Canada. In the year 2021, researchers cut thin sections of the recovered timber using steel blades to locate a specific carbon isotope generated by a massive burst of cosmic radiation. In the year 993, a sudden release of cosmic radiation strikes the Earth. High-energy protons originate from a rapid magnetic eruption on the surface of the Sun. These protons travel across 93 million miles of empty space and enter the upper atmosphere of the Earth. The fast-moving protons collide physically with nitrogen atoms suspended in the air. The physical impact ejects subatomic particles from the nitrogen nuclei, converting the nitrogen atoms into carbon-14. Carbon-14 functions as a radioactive isotope possessing an unstable nucleus. The atmospheric wind currents mix these newly formed carbon-14 atoms with oxygen molecules to create heavy radioactive carbon dioxide gas. The gas descends through the layers of the atmosphere toward the surface of the planet. Along the coast of North America, living fir and juniper trees absorb the carbon dioxide through microscopic pores located on the undersides of their green needles. The trees utilize the absorbed carbon to build new cellular structures during the spring and summer seasons. During the active growing period of the year 993, the coastal trees form a distinct ring of wood directly beneath their bark. This specific layer of timber contains a high concentration of the radioactive carbon-14 isotope. As the autumn season arrives, the air temperature drops, and the tree ceases generating new cells, sealing the elevated chemical levels permanently inside the solid wood. 28 years later, in the year 1021, Norse colonists occupy the timber longhouses on the Apaves Bay Terrace. A Norse worker walks into the surrounding broadleaf and coniferous forest, carrying a forged iron axe. The metal blade features a sharp, wedge-shaped edge formed by heating iron in a stone forge and striking it with a heavy steel hammer. The worker swings the heavy axe into the trunk of a balsam fir tree. The sharp iron edge slices cleanly through the vertical cellulose fibers of the wood, leaving a smooth, flat, diagonal surface. The worker strikes the tree repeatedly until the trunk separates from the root system and falls onto the damp forest floor. The physical severing of the trunk immediately halts all biological growth within the tree. The sequence of tree rings ends exactly at the outer bark layer, permanently marking the final year of cellular division. The Norse colonists chop the felled tree into smaller wooden segments using iron hand axes. They discard off-cut pieces of the fir branch and pieces of a chopped juniper shrub into the adjacent peat bog. The wet sphagnum moss covers the discarded wood, submerging it in cold, acidic water. The water blocks atmospheric oxygen from reaching the wood, preventing aerobic bacteria from consuming the cellulose and preserving the precise cut marks in the timber. In the year 2021, scientists at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands analyzed 3 specific pieces of this chopped wood excavated from the Lanso Meadows bog. The researchers examined the ends of the wood pieces under optical microscopes. The glass lenses magnify the smooth cut marks produced by the metal axe blades. The scientists use sharp steel scalpels to cut thin strips of wood from the individual tree rings. They slice the rings sequentially, starting from the center of the branch and moving outward toward the bark. They place the individual wood shavings into small glass beakers. The workers pour heated acidic and alkaline chemical solutions over the wood shavings. The chemicals dissolve the natural resin and lignin, leaving pure white cellulose fibers in the beakers. The scientists heat the cellulose to extremely high temperatures inside a sealed quartz tube, burning the material and capturing the resulting carbon dioxide gas. They convert the gas into solid graphite powder and place the powder into an accelerator mass spectrometer. This large scientific instrument uses strong magnetic fields to accelerate the carbon atoms to high velocities. The machine forces the moving atoms through a curved physical path. The heavier carbon-14 atoms travel along a wider physical arc than the lighter carbon-12 atoms. The spectrometer physically counts the individual carbon-14 atoms striking the detector at the end of the machine. The digital readouts display a sharp increase in the carbon-14 levels within a specific interior tree ring. The researchers match this elevated chemical measurement directly to the documented global solar radiation event of the year 993. They place the cross-section of the wood under a magnifying lens. They locate the specific ring containing the carbon-14 increase. They use a metal pin to count the subsequent rings moving outward toward the final layer of cut wood. The scientists count exactly 28 additional tree rings between the solar radiation marker and the exterior bark. Adding 28 individual years of growth to the year 993 establishes the exact cutting date of the timber as the year 1021. This mathematical calculation provides the precise year the Norse colonists harvested timber on the North American continent. The physical artifacts recovered from the site remain inside climate-controlled museum display cases. Visitors walk across the hard floors of the room's provincial museum to view the oxidized bronze cloak pin, the carved soapstone spindle wall, and the rusted iron ship rivets. In Iceland, the bound vellum manuscripts rest flat on wooden shelves inside library vaults. Scholars turn the thick animal skin pages to read the black iron gall ink, detailing the voyages of Leif Erikson and Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir. The handwritten words record the exact sailing routes across the Labrador Sea and the birth of Snorri Thorfinnsson inside the sod-walled structures. The genetic sequences transported by the indigenous North American woman replicate continuously inside the blood cells of living human populations. The physical evidence of the Vinland colony exists in the excavated soil of Newfoundland, the dried parchment texts of Scandinavia, and the digital DNA databases maintained by modern scientists.